main campus. It's interesting to be back in Grand Rapids, because as a 28-year-old think tank analyst at the Acton Institute, I would often watch the White House faith-based office, led by this public intellectual, with two last names I really couldn't pronounce. And Stanley was my professor, even though he didn't know it, though the lecture was in DC and the classroom was in Grand Rapids. When I left GR, I decided to pastor a church in New Jersey, where I started to go to Rutgers and learn about economics and community development. And learning the things that I had learned, I pastored an ugly warehouse church that was in the Manhattan-facing suburbs of New Jersey. It was a local paper mill and down the road, and it would waft this burnt vanilla flavor that would seem to waft into the foyer, so it was ugly and it smelled. But these were our people, and we loved it. And unbeknownst to me, this would become the church laboratory where we would experiment on the ideas of public justice for the common good. I think the big idea that opened our eyes is we began to see the world through the eyes of public officials. And I would often take prayer walks, and the Lord began to speak to me, and he said, Jame, I want you not to just pastor the city, but I want you to reach into the city. I had no idea what that meant. And I began to develop an animated public theology. And I knew that I would have to learn the rhythms of our sacred sector by pastoring public policy, our practices, and how we would publicly position ourselves. I began to contextualize my seminary readings of Abraham Kuyper while developing a grounded theory in hermeneutics consistent with my global Pentecostal practices, and a public theology began to emerge. Yes, it's true, John Jefferson Davis called me his Kuyperian Pentecostal. In this space, I knew it had to be done. I just had no idea how to structure it. In the summer of 2010, I found myself in that DC classroom of the Civitas program, and my professor was literally Dr. Stanley Carlton Teese. I listened to him share the contours of public policy, best practices in ministries across the country who had publicly positioned themselves for economic justice. And as I reflected on my ministry in New Jersey, I knew exactly where we were going, straight to jail. I was structured completely wrong. On the train back to Manhattan, I was just buzzing with ideas. And the Lord began to speak to me again. He said, Jame, I want you to pursue economic justice. But the pursuit needed practice. Again, I had no idea what that meant. But an insight set began to develop, and I want to share that with you. First, pastors are called to pastor the city, their public policy. Second, pastors are called to pursue public justice in best practices. And third, pastors are called to publicly position themselves to do justice. And we discovered that our senior population had a real food insecurity, so we developed a 501c3 community development corporation because I had been coached by Stanley to do that and to address this issue. We soon won a grant from the National Fatherhood Initiative and began to invest in fatherlessness and work towards that problem. And as you can see on the screen, in 2012, tragedy struck Manhattan as Hurricane Sandy poured down its wrath on New Jersey. So much water. Dow Chemical Corporation had a satellite office right down the street from our church. They called the city officials and said, who has the best practices and structure to be able to make a donation to heal this community? And because we were structured properly, because we were positioned well, because we had the infrastructure and we had the right theological and public frameworks, they made a deposit right into our account. Why? Because we had become masters of leveraging nothing into something. And how? Because we were structured correctly for public justice, because of the direct influence of Dr. Stanley Carlton Teese. As our ministry closed in New Jersey, an incredible opportunity opened in Tidewater. And I couldn't believe our new ministry in Yorktown could provide the sacred space to do public justice in a way I could never imagine. See, our every square inch was growing. As I sat in my new office in the Warren Tidewater area on our 18-acre campus, I thought, what in the world have I gotten myself into? 28 people voted us in to a building that was in debt $1.3 million. We were losing $100,000 a year. The preschool was completely broke. The building hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. And the bylaws hadn't been touched since Acts 2. Again, I walked our 18-acre campus, and the Lord began to speak to me. He said, Jame, Stanley taught you what to do in Jersey, and now it's time to publicly apply it and position yourself to do justice. See, pastors are called to pastor their city, to pastor their public policy. 2, pastors are called to pursue justice with best practices. And 3rd, pastors are called to publicly position themselves to do justice. Using CPJ's idea to promote the common good, the sacred sector on the ground floor, we practical coaching from Stanley and the legal mind of Chelsea, we began to bridge and began to become socially and economically embedded in our community. As we leaned into our community, we discovered that childcare in the Commonwealth of Virginia is $1,200 a month. So I remember thinking $1,200 a month. And to make it even worse, our primary market were underpaid military families in Tidewater. So I put together a team, financial team. We began to run a net present value of 0 to see how fast we could get there. And what we discovered was this, is that we could undercut the market by $400 and offer $800 a month for premier child care. So again, we launched another 501c3 at the direction of Stanley, and lots of emails about how to structure it correctly. And because of the intellectual and practical influence of CPJ and some other partners, our church is structured with several nonprofits, several LLCs, an endowment, and YMCA MOU with 3 soccer fields for moderate to low income families, as well as an MOU with the NEMTs who use our building for coastal flooding and staging. All 100% debt-free. In 5 years, we were able to architect a $4.5 million turnaround, and by year 10, we will be at a $30 million turnaround. The intellectual and practical framework for our retirement community on a triple nut lease on our property is built specifically off of the report Called to Care, Honoring the Elders and Family Journey, that was put out by the Center for Public Justice. Our board read it, our staff read it, our funders read it. The intellectual capital came from this center. And again, we can undercut the market by several $1,000s. Because of God's grace in our church, and God's incredible turnaround story, our church now publicly supports Stanley's work here at the IRFA as a missionary to the public square. A missionary to the public square. I tell these stories not to make myself the hero, because the heroes, our real heroes, are in this room. To the executives and the senior leadership and incredible staff, I want you to know your work is important and it matters. To the board and the supporters of CPJ, your work matters to people like me on the ground floor, grinding it out in the pain and people's lives. To Dr. Skillen, who I thought would be in the room, to Dr. Stanley Carlton Cease, I say thank you to your faithfulness and your calling. There is permanence in your work. Permanence. As a theologian, I thank you for public pluralism and principled pluralism, which gives me frameworks in order to operate as an economist. And as a lead pastor whose church is socially and economically embedded in the community, I say thank you, because you saved 2 of my ministries. 2 of my ministries. The work we do here matters, and it's important, because it's real people's lives. Victory Church has and always will be supported the Center for Public Justice. At this time, I want to invite our board chair up, John Boss, John, I'm going to give to you, this is our second check this year from Victory Church out of our missions account. I want to openly challenge you to give not only out of your institutions, but give to you individually. My wife and I talked about this, and at the end of the year, Stephanie, we're going to cut a check out of our donor advised fund, the Center for Public Justice. So thank you.